Funding for this program was made possible by the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, Carnegie Mellon University, the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Thank you.
I think diversity is important because you can embrace more.
It definitely brings a lot of different new and perspectives.
But instead of embracing diversity as an asset, some people are threatened by it. Can all Americans practice their faith without fear, as our founding fathers envisioned?
United States is a free country. People should have the freedom to worship whatever they like.
And that's the theme of a book titled Out of Many Faiths. Eboo Patel is the author.
When all of us partner together, that's when we have the opportunity to achieve respect for different identities, relationships between different communities, and a positive contribution and commitment to the common good.
Pittsburgh is exploring the value of diversity in democracy when it comes to race, religion, faith, or no faith at all, and not thinking of America as a melting pot, but as a potluck that welcomes contributions from all.
End of the day, it leads to a better outcome when you have more people come to the table.
From WQED's Fred Rogers Studio, Our Compelling Interests, with your host, Lisa Washington.
Welcome. It happened here in Pittsburgh and around the world. Religious bias, hate crimes, and murders, all too often fueled by intolerance. WQED is hosting an event to address these issues that divide us. This evening, we are pleased to welcome a studio audience invited to listen, to learn, and to share some thoughts of their own. And they've come as part of the Our Compelling Interests project. The topic this hour, religious diversity. Our panel features Eboo Patel, who is the author of the book Out of Many Faiths. Also joining us, Rabbi Jeffrey Myers of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We're also pleased to welcome Pittsburgh's Mayor Bill Peduto and Robert Jones, the CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. Gentlemen, welcome. Great to be able to have this time to speak with you. Eboo, I want to begin with you as the author of Out of Many Faiths. Religion, we know, is as old as human history. Organized religion is older than some universities, libraries, new media, and many of what we think of as the world's oldest institutions. Why has religious belief been so critical to human society?
Well, for someone like me, an American Muslim, I think it's because God created human beings and human beings created society. And so the Muslim belief here is that God creates Adam by picking up clay and giving it his breath, and then makes Adam his Abd and Khalifa, his servant and representative on earth. And one of the things that distinguishes God's creation is its diversity. And so we human beings are charged by God with flowing with this diversity, with engaging this diversity positively. And so I think that that's the beginning of all of this. And over the course of time, human beings have responded to what I think is our creation by God and our desire both to understand the universe and to connect with other human beings through a variety of theologies and interpretations of the divine.
How then do we learn to appreciate diversity?
Well, for me, again, it begins theologically. The truth that God makes the world diverse. In the Holy Quran, there's the line that God says to Adam, "Tell me the names of creation." The term is not name, it's not singular, it's plural, it's names. Creation is not a monoculture, creation is diverse. And so I think that part of how this begins is recognizing that this is what the creation was meant to be. I think there's another part of it that's sociological, which is the ways that people from a variety of backgrounds have contributed to human societies. And so one of the things I love about the metaphor of the United States, not as a melting pot, but as a potluck is really boring if everybody brings the same dish, right? You need people to bring distinct dishes, to bring their best. Nobody brings their worst dish to a potluck, and to pay some attention to who else is going to be at the potluck. First of all, so that you bring food that everybody is able to eat and would enjoy, and secondly, so that you bring food that kind of works well with what other people are bringing. And so this notion of a diversity bonus, right? Welcoming the contributions of people and communities from a range of identities. I think that is the source of American greatness. When the United States has not done that, it has been not only sinful in the way it violates the dignity of other human beings, but detrimental to our greatness and achievement as a nation.
Mr. Jones, I want to get your perspective on that, because you heard Eboo say that has not always been the case, especially here in America. What is your thought about us not embracing diversity and not maybe wanting to try all the dishes that were to be at a potluck?
Well, I think it's easy to forget how radical an experiment the United States really is, particularly even compared to not that far back in Western European history, where you have a kind of nation state. It has one religion that's the official religion, and that's kind of binds religion and politics together. And in the U.S., to be sure, we've done that in fits and starts, but this experiment where the nation state set up a protective space for more than one religion was quite new, right, and quite radical, and I think many people are betting on it to fail. It's an experiment that we're still struggling with today, I think, and this tension between religion, which in its kind of root meaning is a thing that binds people together, can bind people together into tribes, or it can bind people together in a way that builds bridges across lines of difference. And this tension between these two different ways that religion can bind people together, I think is one of the things that we're still living out very much today.
And I want you to speak a little bit about your work, because you forecast the decline of white Christian America.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about the U.S. context is that there is this kind of freedom of religion from the get-go, protected in the Constitution, and yet at the same time there was a de facto kind of establishment of basically a white Protestant Christian world that was so dominant in the culture. So there's a way in which the principle and the practice the rubber didn't really have to meet the road, right? Because there was this de facto establishment. But one of the things that we've experienced just in the last decade is that we have moved for the first time in this country from being a majority white Christian country. So just 10 years ago, the country was 54% white and Christian. If you take all Christian groups together, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, non-denominational, the latest numbers that we have from PRRI are that number has dropped now to 41%, just about 1.3 percentage points over the last decade. And that means that we've moved from this place of being where we have always historically been, a majority white Christian nation, to one that is no longer a majority white Christian nation. And that transition is a real milestone, and I think it underlies a lot of the cultural angst that we're experiencing at this kind of tipping point in the country.
Mayor Peduto, I will turn to you next, because Pittsburgh is a city of bridges. How do we bring together, how do we create a space for the successful and inclusive dialogues around religion and our differences?
Well, it's like in any city, what you want to do is find third places where people can come together. The third place isn't where you work, and it's not where you sleep. It's the faith institution that you belong to. It's the gym. It's the bar. It's the library. It's the playground. It's all of these areas where people will gather. And you make it so that it is inclusive right from the beginning, that it isn't made for one group, but it's made for all groups. And I think that's what government's role is. Government, when it looks at faith, it has to be accepting of all faith. And it should build into that a society which also wants to be a part of that. If you look at the successful areas of this world, they aren't monolithic. They're diverse cultures within major cities that are leading in innovation and change. And it's changing rapidly. It's areas of Southeast Asia that are seeing immigration for probably the first time in decades. It's areas of the United States where people are coming to be able to have the experience of a good job. And it's the people who live in that area that want to have a diverse city that help to continue that. Because basically what you're looking at is the talent, not necessarily the religion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Eboo, I want to turn back to you because we have a question from that was submitted online, actually. It says religious diversity may be easier to address in urban landscapes, but how do we begin to create dialogues in rural areas? You heard the mayor talk about the Pittsburgh, a city, being able to bring a diverse group of people. How do you do that in a rural setting?
Right. So, I remember being in upstate New York a couple of years ago, going to speak at a college campus, and it's about an hour from a regional airport, so it's in a pretty rural area. And the college administrator who's driving me there says, I guess it's kind of neat that you're coming to talk about religious diversity, but we don't really have that much of it here. And as we're driving, we see a sign that says, watch out for horse and buggies, Amish community, right?
Okay.
And I'm like, what do you think that is, right? And so, there's a great line by Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead, don't tell me this town ain't got no heart when I can hear it beat out loud. I think about that when it comes to diversity, right? Don't tell me this place doesn't have any diversity. Pay attention to the dimensions of diversity that you have here, and it might surprise you, right? And so there are many VA hospitals in rural areas with plenty of Hindu and Muslim doctors, for example. There are Amish and Mennonite communities strewn across rural areas across the United States of America. There are rural areas with meat processing plants in which there's a rising number of Somali Muslim laborers, right? And so diversity is no longer just a Chicago or Lower East Side of New York or Pittsburgh phenomenon anymore. It's strewn across the country in really interesting ways, and I think religious diversity is a part of that mix.
Rabbi Myers, I want you to bring in your perspective to this conversation and how we bring in interfaith efforts in the greater Pittsburgh area. Obviously, following the massacre at the Tree of Life, there were a number of outpouring of support from different communities of faith. Talk about how we bring together those interfaith efforts in Pittsburgh.
We need to see to it that these opportunities are not skipped. There are so many ways that we've received love, and we need to return that love. And the ways that we're doing that is to reach out to other communities throughout the immediate Pittsburgh area and learn more about each other. If the religious leaders can't model that behavior, how can we expect any of our parishioners or congregants to do the same sort of thing? So we find ways that we can be together. What are the things that are common about us? And we all learn at the end, there is so much more that we have in common that really separates us, that makes us different. And by showing those opportunities publicly, the rest of the community, the rest of the country, the rest of the world can see that this is possible for people of different faiths to sit down together, to break bread, to share in our common humanity.
I know that you had not been in Pittsburgh long prior to last October's massacre. How do you think that changed this city?
What I came to learn is that it made the people even closer. To me, as an immigrant to Pittsburgh, I've come to learn that people know how to get along well with each other in various faith communities, but perhaps they then show the rest of the world that this can be a norm. This doesn't have to be unique. This doesn't have to be just something about Pittsburgh, but that Pittsburgh can teach the rest of our nation for sure. This is how good people can get along and work and help each other. So I don't know if I could say Pittsburgh changed. From what I've learned, this is what Pittsburgh was already about, and we've just shown the rest of the world that this is the way you can be and should be.
I see you nodding, Mayor Peduto.
If there hadn't been people working for the past few decades on interfaith dialogue, the outpouring that you would have witnessed October 27th and October 28th would have probably been different. But the connections that were made between leaders of various religions, getting to know each other personally, and understanding that an attack against one is an attack against all. As I stood outside of Tree of Life on that Saturday morning, I looked across the street and I saw my friend Wazi Muhammad. and Wazi was the head of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. But then I looked next to him, and the executive board was standing there in the rain. And I just went up, I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "We had to be here." And that doesn't happen overnight. That's years and years in the making. That is Pittsburgh. And when the Jewish community needed the other faith leaders in those communities to be there for them, they were. But at the same time, after September 11th, the Jewish community was there to support our Muslim neighbors. There is something about Pittsburgh that is, maybe it's being a leader in interfaith dialogue, but I think it goes a little bit further than that as well. And I think that it was exemplified these past 6 months.
Beth Dolinar is our audience host, and I believe you have someone who has a question. Beth.
Thanks, Lisa. Your question?
Hi. I was wondering how to enact change in congregations, and given the often conservative religions, how do we encourage these places of worship to pursue and balance commitments towards a more progressive and positive community engagement?
You know, I think one of the real challenges, and I'll just be blunt about it, is I do think that white Christian congregations have a lot of work to do on this front. That one of the, I think, struggles that we're having, I think, is that there are a group, you know, that this group, white Christians, have essentially, you know, been in power, been in charge for all of the country's life. And we really are at a place where that is sort of fading from, that world is really fading from the scene. I entitled my recent book, The End of White Christian America, to kind of talk about this phenomenon and the kind of transition that's happening. And it calls on, I think, some courageous leaders in the white Christian community to help sort of tell a continuous story about how, some mentioned a table metaphor earlier, but how those churches can, I think, and Christians in general, can pull up a chair to a table that nobody owns, rather than trying to invite people to a chair and to a table that they essentially feel like they own. And I think that's a new moment that we're at, and we're still, I think, inching our way toward it. One quick thing I'll just say, underlying what Eboo said about, this is happening everywhere. This is not a bi-coastal, urban phenomenon. You can see it in the data in Pennsylvania, which has plenty of rural areas. 10 years ago, 2/3 of Pennsylvania was white and Christian, and 10 years later, our latest data has that number down to 54%. Right, so again, it's the same kind of drop that you're seeing, much more diversity. It's true in Kansas, it's true in Oklahoma, all through the Midwest. It's not just kind of big cities and the coast. So there's a lot more opportunity there, but I think there's also some real tensions that I think we're still working through.
Yes, Rabbi Myers.
I don't think the answer comes solely from houses of worship. Well, I love the metaphor that we're potluck. The thing about potluck is eventually the meal ends and you go home. And what have you gained with the meal? I think we need to do a lot more in our public schools to refine our education. For years we were STEM education, then we were STEAM education. I think we need to move to stream education, add an R for religion. We don't know our neighbors. And Mr. Rogers taught us about our neighbors. We don't know our neighbors. We don't know the beauty of their faiths at all. And how do children grow up knowing anything about what the world is like if they don't learn anything about the practices of their neighbors? And that for most kids, half of the world is not their religion. And how are they going to learn that if not in a setting where they're all together and they can experience what other faiths are about, see other role models from other faiths, visit houses of worship and be able to see that, wow, you know, they're not so different. And where are kids going to learn that?
And Eboo, I have to imagine that was part of your experience growing up in America, that your friends who you've met here were not as familiar with you or being Muslim or, you know, being here in America had to be somewhat difficult for you.
Well, you know, my friends in high school, my friend group in high school, the kids I ate lunch with included a Nigerian evangelical, a South Indian Hindu, a Cuban Jew, a Mormon, a Lutheran, and a lapsed Catholic, right? And that's not a joke. That's an American high school right now.
Okay.
And part of what's interesting is that our faith played some role in our lives, but nobody ever talked about it. And the only time I ever remember religion being a part of the conversation in my high school was when a group of thugs started going after my Jewish friend. And so with anti-Semitic slurs. And I think it's deeply ironic and deeply sad that the people who were willing to engage religion in my public school were the ones who were happy to be spewing anti-Semitism. In other words, we didn't have the language or the kind of courage to have a proactive, positive conversation about people's diverse religious identities. Having said that, I think that there's not a hospital within 30 square miles of here, or probably 300 square miles, that's not an interfaith project, which is to say that there are patients from a range of religious backgrounds whose religious orientation conditions what they do when a child is born, how they define a particular disease, what happens after a death, and even what the definition of death is, right? And there's nurses and doctors and administrators from a range of religious backgrounds who went into a healing profession because they were inspired by their religion to do so. I think that these kinds of third spaces, right, these civic spaces, whether it's the Greater Pittsburgh Food Depository, which is probably an interfaith project, or any of the schools within 25 square miles, which are interfaith projects, or hospitals, part of what we can do is learn to have a positive and proactive conversation about how our diverse religious identities inspire us to do things that are positive and contribute to the community. And so in so many ways, it's just kind of adding just a little bit to what Dr. Jones and Mayor Peduto and Rabbi Myers said.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Thanks, Lisa. Your question?
Yes. How can we increase the dialogue, the conversation beyond tolerance that can impact the democratic process and the democratic ideals? And I'd like to know if you have any possible takeaways.
You know, first thing I'd say is get off Facebook, get off Twitter. Social media tends to gravitate towards the extremes of all sides. And then you start to believe that that's the way the world really is. Most people are more in the middle, and most people are kind. The way to be able to do that, I think, begins first with practicing it. There was a young man whose name was Sandeep Patel. He was the victim of a race-motivated hate crime about 15 years ago. He was the only survivor. He was a partial quadriplegic, which I didn't know what that meant before, but what it means is you can't move your arms, you can't move your legs, but you have all the feeling in them. You can feel all the pain or the itch. Sandeep forgave his shooter, and he said, very simple, it's how you treat your mother, it's how you treat your brother, it's how you treat your sister or your grandma or your child, and then it's how you treat your neighbor, and then it's how you treat a stranger. And if you take that and you know that that's what you're doing, you're making that difference all immediately. And if other people are doing it, I know it may sound like it will take forever, but if we allow ourselves to get drawn into the hate, then we get poisoned by it. Sandeep passed away a few years ago, but he was somebody who could show that even in the worst situation in life, you still can have compassion.
Mr. Jones, will it take a long time? The mayor said that we're becoming more diverse faster than many of us imagine. Will it take a long time for us to imagine a place where our diversity is more of an asset than a threat?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When we ask Americans in public opinion polls, 2/3 of Americans today already say that diversity is an asset for the country. So the vast majority of Americans are leaning in to the changes in the country. What we have is a set of vocal minority in the country, a very small group of Americans that are very threatened by this and are reacting in very violent ways against it. One thing I'll say, though, is that we do have what you might call a diversity lag at the ballot box. And this goes to your question about democratic process. and that we are about 8 years behind at the ballot box, and when you're looking at racial and religious diversity, where we already are in the country today. So it'll be like 2024 before the full effects of the diversity in the country actually shows up at the ballot box. The main reason for that is that older white Christian voters turn out to vote at rates higher than other Americans do, and so they're disproportionately represented at the ballot box. So we have this kind of maybe like a time machine effect in a way that, in some ways you might even think about this next election, instead of being the 2020 election, demographically speaking, it will be more like the 2012 election, demographically speaking, because the demographics at the ballot box, unless turnout patterns change, are going to look like the country did 8 to 10 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's take another question.
Your question?
Should the universities try to encourage opportunities for discussions of the diverse faiths, provide spaces for such discussions and expressions of faith, and celebrate diversity in faith in general?
So how do we combine those third spaces?
So this happens to be what my organization does. So thank you so much for asking that question, sir. And I'm actually proud to be here with a high school friend of mine, Eric Garrett, who went to the same high school that I did, and he now works at a university here in Pittsburgh. And so we're happy to send our best from the western suburbs of Chicago to Duquesne University to teach philosophy and communications. But Eric was involved with an effort that my organization, Interfaith Youth Corps, started with the Obama administration, which is called the President's Interfaith Campus Community Service Challenge. And the big idea there is that college campuses are laboratories and launching pads for interfaith cooperation. They ought to be places where you can have a positive and proactive conversation about religious diversity, and we think that the most inspiring way that that happens is around interfaith service projects. Service is a theological command in every faith and philosophical tradition. Young people love being involved in interfaith service projects, and it's a great way for them to build bonds across religious traditions, deepen into their own religious or secular tradition, and build some relationships along the way, right? And get some service done. And so we work with over 500 campuses to develop those kinds of projects, and part of what we realized along the way is as we're helping these campuses develop interfaith service projects, there's an intellectual component to this, right? So campuses develop interfaith studies academic programs, and there's a leadership component. The people who start those service projects are interfaith leaders. And one of the things I thought to myself coming in on your beautiful bridges, Mayor Peduto, is you don't have bridges unless you have bridge builders. Bridges don't fall from the sky or rise from the ground. People build them. And that's the case with physical structures, and it's the case with interfaith bridges. We need our college campuses to be the kind of places that are nurturing a generation of interfaith bridge builders.
So are we talking about creating a framework so that we embrace becoming more inclusive?
So I think that one of the wonderful things that campuses do is they articulate a vision of what educated people and effective citizens can be. I think a part of that vision should include becoming an interfaith leader, right? They nurture a knowledge base and a skill set. You learn content, you develop skills in college, and then colleges are also mini civil societies where you can run the projects you learn about in the classroom. And just like people do really inspiring interracial bridge building in college campuses and campus community service partnerships, we think that they should be doing interfaith projects as well.
And Rabbi, is this what you're thinking when you say stream education?
Yeah, it needs to involve all citizens of all ages to take those bridges. Bridges are wonderful, but they're only good if people walk on them, and they're only good if they're two-way. So bridge can't be one way. It has to be occupied and used. Otherwise, it's just an empty structure.
Mayor.
Just real quick, I think universities are absolutely critical, but they're already a diverse gathering. Years ago, before I was the mayor, I used to partner with a group called Venture Outdoors. They're an outdoors activities organization here in Pittsburgh, and we created Pedal Paddle Peduto, which was biking trips, kayak trips, hikes. We would do it once a month. And the most popular by far was an interfaith biking trip. So we would bicycle throughout the East End. We would stop at synagogues, churches, and the Islamic Center. And we would study the architecture of the beautiful buildings, but then we'd go inside. And there would be a priest at the Catholic Cathedral there to talk about Catholicism. And we'd go up to the Greek Orthodox Church, and a deacon would be there to welcome us. We'd go to Rodef Shalom, and a rabbi would be there. We'd go to the Islamic Center, and imam would be there. And you can see this on YouTube. There's some great video of us riding all around doing it. But that brought together people. We would say the same thing. How many to the people there, for how many in this room, this is your first time in a synagogue? And all the hands go up. And then, the 10 Commandments are on the wall. Why are the 10 Commandments on? The misunderstanding of how common our religions are was really brought to the attention. In fact, I always remember the imam was saying, there's more about Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible. You know more about Jesus's mom and her father than you do by reading the Bible. And his joke was, we just don't believe that he has come yet, that he is coming, and we'll just have to wait till he gets here and we'll have to ask him. And he broke it down to like, this is not differences, there's more commonality between our religions. But where did I learn about that? I did it when our local Boy Scouts invited me. And in that local Boy Scout troop, every single one of those guys were white Christians. So there was no one who had been in a synagogue. There was no one who had met an imam. And so it's not just the college universities. If you can do it with an outdoors organization, you can do it with anything.
Mr. Jones, is that hard to expand to a majority white Christian America? It's a phenomenal idea, but is that hard to do?
Well, what's firing in my mind is that what we find, we ask Americans about where their hopes are. It's easy to find their despairing points because of all the national headlines and the political polarization in the country. But what we do find is while people do see at the national level politics pulling people apart, in many ways the nationalized media pulling people apart, where they're more optimistic is actually in the kinds of organizations we're talking about, like community organizations that are on the ground. That's where they see organizations that are still pulling people together much more than they're pulling people apart. So I actually think this kind of movement is going to have to be a kind of very grounded in local institutions, kind of shoe leather kind of movement, and that's where Americans really are much more optimistic today.
Let's take another question from Beth from the audience.
What's your question?
Good evening, peace to the panelists, and thank you, WQED, for having such a unique forum. This is so important. I'm interested in the narrative and the history of our nation, because whatever controls the narrative controls perception. And it's so vital, especially in times like these, in my humble opinion, that we begin to teach the truth, or the truths, plural, that have never been shared to our students, to our theologians, to our faith groups, and throughout this nation, because that's the real problem. You wouldn't have xenophobia, you wouldn't have racism, you wouldn't have bigotry if people knew the truth.
Changing the narrative can be difficult. How do we make sure that the truth is told?
I think America has been a potluck in a variety of forums that aren't known about, which is to say that there are significant contributions by a range of communities, including and sometimes especially those that were forcibly barred from full participation. They still contributed in ways that make this American civilization. So one of my favorite examples of this is actually a musical example. There's a great line. It's on the early track in Mos Def's Black on Both Sides, where he says, we went from chain gang line hopping to bebopping to hip hopping, Invisible Man got the whole world watching. And if you trace that back, which is to say, if you trace the most popular music of the day, which is hip hop,
yes,
you will find hundreds of years ago turn of the Islamic Adhan in that. And what I mean by that is that most of the people ripped off the west coast of Africa, brought here as slaves in the throughout the 17th century, they came from Muslim majority societies where the Muslim call to prayer would have settled their souls and rung in their ears 5 times a day. That musical experience helps give rise to the field chants of slaves over the course of the early part of American history, which turns into the blue notes in blues and jazz, which of course is taken by people like Little Richard and Elvis and turns into rock and roll, which is taken then by groups like Public Enemy, etc., and turns into hip hop. So as Thich Nhat Hanh said, a poet will see a cloud in this piece of paper. Somebody who knows the breadth of American history will hear the Islamic call to prayer in contemporary hip hop.
I want to ask you a question, but before I do, I want to read part from your book, if you don't mind. My question is this a time and a space now where it is safe for those of varying religious faiths to be proud and to be expressive of their religion? I want to read from you from page 80 of your book. As it was with the Jews and the chosen, so it is with Muslims now. No nation on earth has a Muslim community that is more ethnically, racially, or theologically diverse than in the United States. For many years, those various Muslim groups created separate spaces, mosques, schools, community centers, and so on. Those who were less ritualistically observant often found no space at all. Then you go on to talk about the example of Aziz Ansari, a comedian who hosted Saturday Night Live the day after President Trump's inauguration. At that point, he chose to represent. Are we at a space now? Is this a safe time in America where that can happen?
So, you know, there's a great line by Susan Sontag, whatever is happening, there is always something else going on. And so on the one hand, I think you are seeing a wider number of people saying, I'm tired of the overt racism of our particular era, especially given that it comes on the end of of centuries of overt discrimination, and I'm going to be proudly who I am and contribute as who I am to the American experiment. And then you have the experience of heinous, deadly crimes of extremism, which make people scared, right?
Yes.
Like my mom, both of my kids were born in kind of an early iteration of contemporary Islamophobia around the madness around the Ground Zero Mosque. And my mom says, you know, don't give them Muslim names. You give them American names. And I'm like, Mom, Muslim names are American names, right? So my mom, who's a deeply pious, believing Muslim, like she's concerned. She's afraid. And on the other hand, you've got all kinds of American Muslims who for decades did dissimulate, did hide part of who they are, saying, I'm tired of this. I'm going to be who I am. And by the way, who I am is not only beautiful, but it's part of what makes America, America.
Your thoughts, Rabbi Myers?
You know, as I read your book, the thing that immediately came to my mind was that the various Muslim communities in the United States are going through what the Jewish community went through decades ago in terms of how to adapt to whatever that image is of what life in America is or can be, yet remain faithful to your faith simultaneously. And the evolution of Islam in the United States is an interesting thing to observe because it can go back 50, 100 years to see that's where the Jewish community was, where you are now. So it might be instructive to look a little more into how did the Jewish community cope with coming here in 2 major waves of immigration. First, the German Jews that came in the 1850s, and then Eastern European Jews that came mostly in the late 1800s, to see how did they adapt to those same challenges. And I think here's a wonderful opportunity for dialogue between our faiths to see how can we work together to see these new iterations of American Islam, which is occurring, not because you choose it to occur, but because that's the nature of growing up in America, that these things occur. Just as there are varying forms of American Judaism, I'm expecting the same thing's going to happen with various Islamic communities, the same sort of thing. And it could be, I think, a really wonderful conversation to explore the history to see how can that be instructive.
You know, that's what Lisa just read from a part of my book where I was quoting from Chaim Potak's The Chosen, which is this great historical novel on the experience of American Jews in World War II America.
Excellent. Let's take another question from the audience.
What's your question?
Should society accommodate the intolerant groups, and should they exist? To what extent, on what condition are societies required to step up and intervene?
We know that hate speech creates hate crime. It just doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's built up. People become desensitized. It becomes accepted. And then the next step is violence. It's been shown again and again and again, tragically, the results throughout this country. But we also recognize that the freedom of speech is something which is guaranteed. However, all of our freedoms have limits or restrictions that are placed on it, and the Constitution was written in just that way, that we could ask the questions and then be able to create the laws that will first and foremost guarantee us the right to life. So when we have this discussion about how we eradicate hate speech, many people will use the First Amendment as a counterpoint in saying that there are no limits. But the very fact is that in this country, there not only are limits to any amendment, but there is also a need of society to stand up. If we allow hate speech to go without calling it out for what it is, we allow that cycle to continue. We have to get back to the point where things that are said today, again, I'll use social media, but it's also said at the water cooler at work, wouldn't be acceptable just 5 years ago.
I do think it's really important to see our current moment. There is something happening here. So if you look at the FBI, for example, has reported about a 30% uptick in hate crimes just over the last 3 years. If you look at the number of hate groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center has reported about the same amount, about a 30% uptick in the number of documented hate groups in the country. And the Anti-Defamation League just released a report last week showing that in 2018 there were nearly 1,900 documented cases, which is the highest, one of the 3 highest years they've ever reported since tracking these things way back into the 70s, documented cases against Jews or Jewish institutions. So there is something has shifted in the culture that we're seeing. It's measurable, it's documentable, and I do think it is that we really are at this tipping point, and it's a really important moment, I think, to have this conversation and to start thinking about what sort of interventions there can be, given that we're at this place where there is a kind of backlash movement to the changes that are happening in the country.
When we talk about eradicating intolerance, should we focus on young people or should we focus on adults? Anyone?
Yes. Both.
Is that to make the most impact? Like, what are the next steps? How do you begin that process?
The message just hasn't become clear to our elected leaders that, and I don't use the word H with all due deference to the mayor, and the mayor knows that I call it H speech, that when our elected leaders speak bad ways to each other, I mean, give a perfect example, the feeding frenzy that's now called the Democratic Party, somebody looking to become the lead candidate. The words that come out from one who attacks another, when those things happen, and I've said it more than once, they're giving permission to all of America that it's okay to behave that way because we are, and we're your models for behavior. And when will they learn that you can't speak that way to other people and not expect it to trickle on down to the rest of society? So we're not seeing what we need to have from our elected leaders. And H speech doesn't know political parties. It's on all sides. So that seriously continues to concern me because it's getting worse. And if we're not going to have our elected leaders do that, the only other place it's going to come from is, it says it right in our holy documents, we the people.
So then let's take it away from the political perspective or candidates. I'm in the audience, I'm watching this. What can I do to help get rid of this?
Take the H speech pledge like I did. Don't use the word. It's a really severe word that you don't really need to use. If you don't like something, then just say, I don't like it. more people can begin to think about the choice of words. And when we think about our choice of words, we can tone down the severity of what we say and our intent and move a little less closer to evil acts. Tone down our language is a really critical piece of it.
Is it choice of words or is it actions?
So I think choice of words really matters, right? I mean, the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, "What begins in a word ends in a deed," and I think that there's definitely a connection. But I think that this is principally about achieving American greatness, right? I don't want people thinking to themselves, "Well, I'm not an H'er. I'm not that person. I'm not intolerant. Therefore, I don't have a part in this." We all have a part in this. Because we're not just trying to end the bad stuff, we're trying to achieve the good stuff. And that also takes effort. So what are 3 things you can do? I think number 1 is to proactively learn things that you appreciate and admire about other religious traditions, right? So, in Islam, the most common prayer is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the ever merciful, the all merciful, the ever merciful. How beautiful is that, right? Recognize the contributions of Muslims to American civilization. Everything from, the greatest athlete of the American 20th century, Muhammad Ali, is a Muslim. The person who designed the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Building, who basically creates the architecture for the skyscraper, the engineering, was a Muslim, Fazlur Rahman Khan. The guy who brings Led Zeppelin to America, finds Ray Charles is a Muslim, a guy named Ahmet Erdogan. You can go on and on and on. Again, what can we learn that we appreciate about other traditions? Number 2, learn the theology of interfaith cooperation in your own tradition, right? So in Islam, it's this idea that God makes creation diverse and creates human beings to steward a diverse creation. In Christianity, you could do a lot worse than paying attention to the Good Samaritan story and remembering that the Samaritan was not just an other, but a religious other, followed a different religion, right? And Jesus in the Good Samaritan story says, that's the person who you should follow. And I think the final thing is what Mayor Peduto said, which is organize interfaith projects, whether it's an interfaith bike ride that visits different houses of worship or an interfaith service project on a campus. Organize projects that bring people who orient around religion differently together, from atheist to Zoroastrian, to do something positive and in common and to share what it is that inspires them to help other people.
Let's take another question from the audience. Beth.
Hi, I'm looking for advice on conversations in the third space. So say we find ourselves at the bar with some folks from other religions. What are some questions maybe we should be asking ourselves and our friends to learn more about each other?
What do you think, Eboo? You said you were in a high school with a number of different faiths, different ethnicities. Was it difficult to strike up a conversation that wasn't part of you said religion wasn't part of the conversation?
Well, as I think about it now, there were a million opportunities. We just didn't take them. So I'll give you an example. Somebody would say on a regular basis, I can't play basketball this Sunday because of some prayer thing my mom's making me go to, right? And nobody would ever ask the follow-up question. Nobody would be like, oh, tell me about that, right? So I think that there's that. I don't think that this question can come out of nowhere. I think that there needs to be some information on the table for you to ask a follow-up question about. But here's an interesting one. So if you're in somebody's house and there's clearly a religious object, you ask about that, right? I'm in Ubers and taxis all the time, and I would say like 2 out of 3 Ubers or taxis that I'm in, there's a cross, or there's a Hindu deity, or there's in Arabic, Allah, what looks like a W. You ask about that, right? Part of what I think is really powerful is the recognition that religion isn't just what happens in congregations; it's also what happens at the Greater Pittsburgh Food Depository and in hospitals, which is to say the reason people go into helping professions is oftentimes because of a faith commitment. And maybe the single best example of that in the last 50 years is the guy who held court in this studio for a couple decades, right? Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, and that's not an accident. That's the fact that he had a deep faith commitment and that he talked about looking for helpers, I think those things are connected.
I mean, there has to be kind of an organic nature. You don't want to come across as like a interfaith pickup line, right? Kind of out of nowhere. Yeah. But I do think curiosity is there. And one of the things I found when I was teaching students, particularly Protestant students, is that they often thought about religion just about belief. But religion's much bigger than that, right? But if you're Protestant, it's all about belief, but it's about belonging, it's about behavior, it's about food, it's about icons and art and those kinds of things. So I think a kind of curiosity that doesn't have kind of religion just in this belief box, but it's about kind of a much broader kind of part of human and communal fabric. I think there's many more opportunities, many more doorways in, I think, than often it seems that there are.
Eboo, the title of this discussion is Our Compelling Interests. How much does religion impact us and shape us?
I mean, I think it's key, right? And I'll use a couple of examples from our national life. First of all, I think you could argue that of all the various identity issues that our founders got wrong, race and gender, for example, the one that they came pretty close to getting right was religious diversity. You know, we would take what George Washington said about religious diversity in 1791, we would take it today. We said in response to a Jewish leader, my government will give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, right? And in a lot of ways, the United States is a project is a nation that's responding to the European wars of religion and saying, we want to do things a little bit differently. I think a second reason of religion, and continuing that experiment in an era of even wider religious diversity is really important. And that doesn't just happen. It takes bridges and it takes bridge builders. I'll say two other quick things. The second thing is American civil society, which is to say our social service organizations, our many of our schools, our colleges and universities, our hospitals, the third spaces that the mayor talked about, it's virtually non-existent without religious communities. So the great sociologist Robert Putnam said that religion has probably inspired about 50% of American civil society. So there's of America's 2,800 four-year residential colleges and universities, there are 230 that are founded by various Catholic groups. There's over 100 that were founded by Methodists, including USC, Duke, Syracuse, Emory. There are 24 that were founded by the ELCA. So that's the case when it comes to hospitals, it comes to social service organizations. A third of AA groups meet in churches. The final thing is religious language, beloved community, city on a hill, cathedral of humanity, better angels of our nature. That is so central to how we understand ourselves as Americans, Judeo-Christian nation.
Right.
The question is, what comes next?
And I want to cut you off, but I want to get final thoughts from everyone. Such a great conversation. Robert, I'll begin with you. Final thoughts.
I think I'll just go back to this importance of this time. Like, we really are at a new time in American history, and our generation, I think, is facing a dilemma about kind of our founding principles and really living them out when there's not a guaranteed kind of white Protestant majority that I think every previous generation had sort of counted on as the cultural hegemonic kind of force in the country. So I think this sense, I'm going to go back to the table, are we going to in fact kind of have a model where everyone pulls up a chair around the table on equal terms, and if we can pull that off, we'll be the first generation in America to really pull that off, and that's a really big lift. It's important, and it's going to take some struggle.
Mayor Peduto.
Every Sunday morning, we gather together as Pittsburghers, and we are the most divided that we can be. In many of the places that we gather, there are no Jews, there are no Muslims. And in fact, there's this part of Christianity or this ethnic group of Catholicism. And we gather in those buildings and we talk about the greatness of God. And then we get into our cars, we go home, we put on our Steelers uniform, and we all come together and we don't ask what anyone's religion is or what anyone's race is or how old anybody is. And we're in that stadium all together. What happened? How is it that we were so separate a few hours before, but all together as one? Why can't we do that for more than just sports? Why can't we just do that?
Rabbi Myers.
We focus too much on the weeds in the garden. We need to give more attention to the flowers and don't give as much attention to the weeds. It's easy to do that because you want to just have a beautiful garden, but weeds are part of life. But let's turn our focus away and let's focus on the flowers and the beauty, and we'll find so much that we can share and enjoy together.
Excellent. Eboo.
In one of his essays in the book, Robert quotes the British writer G.K. Chesterton, who said that America is a nation with the soul of a church. We are now a nation with the soul of a church and a synagogue and a mosque and a gurdwara and a sangha and a temple and a secular humanist society. And the question is, how do you make that a jazz show that sounds good together and not a set of different musics that are competing against one another?
Are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful.
I
let Robert be the honest. We have a deal.
Yeah.
We have a deal. I'm going to be the hopeful one.
Yeah.
I'm Simon and you're
the brown Muslim guy.
Right?
You're the brown Muslim guy who's hopeful. I'm the white Christian guy who's a little pessimistic.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been a lively, engaging, and very informative discussion. Thanks for being with us for this look at the issues in the Our Compelling Interest series. Learn more about the series and contributing authors, including our guest, Eboo Patel, on our Compelling Interest website. I'm Lisa Washington. Thanks for joining us.